The meters were moving. That was the first thing I noticed every morning when I came into the control room. The VU meters on the Neve 8078, catching the ambient hum of the building and responding to it. The needles swinging in that specific lazy arc that analog meters make when there is almost nothing to measure, but they are measuring it anyway, because that is what they do. It was a July morning in Memphis, and Leon Cross was in the live room tracking the final vocal on the last song of an album that his manager had already told 2 publications was the best work of his career. Leon was 47 years old and had been nominated for Grammy Awards twice, and had spent 3 years not releasing music because he could not find a room that gave him what he needed. He had found it on Poplar Avenue in a building that 6 months earlier a woman named Christine Marsh had sold me for $1,000. Nora was in her chair in the corner of the control room, the chair with the planet stickers on the ear cups of her headphones, the chair she had been sitting in at every studio session since she was old enough to sit still for one. She was 10 years old, and she was doing weekend reading for school, and occasionally looking up at Leon through the glass with the calm of a child for whom the presence of a Grammy-nominated artist in her father's studio had become, over the course of 3 weeks, simply part of the furniture. 6 months earlier, on a January morning at Christine Marsh's Union Avenue office, Christine had offered me that building in front of 3 witnesses and her note-taking assistant with the warm and entirely constructed generosity of someone performing a favor for maximum visibility. She had called it a worthless shell. She had said she hoped I could find something useful to do with it. She had said it loud enough that her assistant wrote it in the meeting notes without being asked. What Christine did not know, what her property manager had not known, what the bankruptcy liquidator for the previous tenant had not known, was that sitting in the back of that building under a canvas equipment cover was a 1978 Neve 8078 analog mixing console. One of a small number of surviving examples in the world, studios had been built specifically around them, rooms that recording artists fly across continents to use. The console that had been installed by the previous tenant classified as a building fixture in the bankruptcy proceedings, and had therefore passed to me the moment I signed a 1-year lease for $1,000. Leon Cross had flown from Los Angeles specifically to record on it, and Christine Marsh's flagship property on Union Avenue, the building she had been trying to fill for 9 months, the anchor of her commercial portfolio, was being called by her lender that same July morning. I did not know about the lender call until that evening. I was listening to Leon sing. I need to tell you about my grandmother first, because she is the reason any of this makes sense. Loretta Deacon had a piano in the front room of her house in Orange Mound, a neighborhood on the east side of Memphis that is one of the oldest African-American communities in the country, a place with a specific relationship to music that runs through its history, the way certain things run through places that have held something long enough for it to become structural. Loretta played gospel on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings, and on any occasion she considered significant enough to require more than words. She had been playing the same upright piano in that front room since 1961, and she played it the way she did everything. Not for an audience, not for credit, but because the music was the thing, and the thing was sufficient unto itself. She never gave me formal lessons. When I asked her how to play something, she would show me once, slowly, and then she would move to the other end of the bench and give me the space to try it. If I got it wrong, she would wait. If I got it right, she would say, "There it is," in the specific quiet tone of a person confirming something they already knew was going to happen. She said one thing directly that I have thought about more than anything else she ever played. She said it after the 3rd time I had tried something and gotten it wrong and tried it again and gotten it right. She said, "You hear it before you play it. That's the whole thing." She went back to the other end of the bench and did not explain further. She didn't need to. I grew up understanding music the way she played it, as something functional rather than decorative. Not a career goal, not a performance, not a thing you did for other people's approval. The thing you did when the feeling required more than words could carry. I grew up in Orange Mound and never left Memphis. After high school in 1997, I worked various jobs: warehouse, delivery, a 2-year stretch at a distribution center in Whitehaven, and spent every dollar I didn't need on equipment. A used drum machine bought from a classified ad in 1999, a keyboard from a pawn shop on Summer Avenue in 2001, Recording software I learned by watching tutorials on a slow internet connection at hours that are only available to people who do not have to be anywhere in the morning. I built a home studio in my bedroom that was, by 2005, producing tracks that other Memphis artists were paying me to make for them. Not large amounts, enough. I was 26 years old, and I was a producer for hire in the Memphis independent music world, known by the people who made music in this city and unknown by almost everyone else. That was fine. The work was the work. The work was always the work. I met Michelle in 2008. She was a social worker at a community center in Orange Mound, patient and precise and constitutionally unable to let a wrong thing pass without noting it, which made her the most honest person I had ever spent time with. We married in 2011. Nora was born in 2014. Michelle died in October 2018 from an aortic dissection. A Saturday morning, catastrophic and without warning. Nora was 4 years old. I closed my home studio for 6 weeks. Then I opened it again because Nora needed the rhythm of a life that kept moving, and the music was the one thing that had always made complete sense to me, and complete sense was what we both needed. Nora grew up at the studio. She had a chair, an old office chair with a broken left armrest that I had found at a thrift store on Chelsea Avenue in 2016, which she had claimed as hers at age 2 and decorated with stickers of planets and animals over the years until the original upholstery was more sticker than fabric. She brought it with her when I moved studios. It was the chair she sat in. It was where she did homework and read library books and listened to her father work with the specific ease of a child for whom the sound of a session was not background noise but primary experience. By 10 years old, she had opinions about mixes that were occasionally more accurate than the opinions of artists twice her age. She delivered these opinions without hesitation and without particular concern for whether the artist wanted to hear them, which was her mother's quality applied to her father's world, and which produced, more often than not, better records. Christine Marsh had built Marsh Commercial Properties over 20 years into a mid-size commercial real estate operation with 12 properties across Memphis. She was not a music person. She understood square footage and lease terms and cap rates and the specific arithmetic of commercial real estate in a mid-size American city. She was good at this. I want to say that clearly. The story of what happened between us is not the story of an incompetent person failing. It is the story of a person who made a fast assessment based on incomplete information and did not revise it, and who paid a significant price for that failure of revision. She had acquired the Poplar Avenue property in 2019 as part of a 3-building portfolio purchase. The commercial garage unit on the ground floor, approximately 2,400 square feet, she leased to a music production company called Riverside Sound in 2020. Riverside Sound built the space out extensively. Professional soundproofing throughout, mass-loaded vinyl, resilient channels, the kind of treatment that costs real money and requires specialists to install correctly, a floating floor to eliminate vibration transmission, acoustic panels on every surface, an isolation booth in the northeast corner, climate control calibrated for equipment stability, and the centerpiece, a 1978 Neve 8078 analog mixing console installed in the custom-built control room section, connected to the room's patch bay and outboard rack with the thoroughness of people who intended to use this equipment seriously and for a long time. Riverside Sound went bankrupt in 2022. The bankruptcy liquidator came in and cataloged the company's assets: computers, microphones, portable outboard gear, movable items, business assets, liquidated to pay creditors. The Neve console, the acoustic treatment, the floating floor, the isolation booth, these were assessed as structural improvements to the leased property. Fixtures, part of the building under the terms of the lease. They were not included in the liquidation inventory. The console stayed. Christine's property manager walked the space after the bankruptcy and filed a standard vacancy report. The console was noted as fixed audio equipment, condition unknown, value not assessed. Christine never personally inspected the space. She had 12 properties and a property manager she trusted, and a console she had never heard of sitting under a canvas cover 40 feet from the street. For 18 months, the space sat empty. 2 potential tenants looked at it and passed. It was carrying cost with no revenue. It was a problem that needed a solution. A Memphis music licensing attorney named Diane Park had worked with both Christine and me separately over the years and had mentioned to Christine in late 2023 that I was looking for studio space. Christine noted this with the interest of a property owner looking to clear a problem unit. What she decided to do with that information was entirely her choice. She could have called me through Diane with a straightforward lease offer. Instead, she organized a meeting at her Union Avenue office, her flagship address, her best conference room, and arranged for 3 contacts from the Memphis business community to be present before inviting me in. I arrived with Nora, who had a half-day at school. I was 45 years old, and I had been making music in Memphis for 19 years, and I had the specific quality of a man who has long since stopped performing anything for anyone's benefit. I wore what I wore. I sat where I was shown to sit. Christine made her offer: $1,000, 1-year lease, purchase option at the end at assessed value. She said the space was a worthless shell she was tired of carrying. She said she hoped I could find something useful to do with it. She said she was doing me a favor because Diane had spoken well of me and she believed in supporting local creative talent when she could. She said all of this clearly, with her 3 contacts present and her assistant taking notes. Nora was sitting beside me. She was 10 years old, and she had her mother's ability to read a room, and she was reading this one with the complete attention she brought to situations she had correctly identified as significant. She looked at Christine. She looked at me. She said nothing. I looked at Christine. I said, "I'll take it." 2 words, nothing else. I signed the lease at her desk. I took the key. I put it in my jacket pocket and told Nora it was time to go. Christine said something to her contacts after we left, something about hoping the space would be an improvement over whatever I had been working out of. One of her contacts told someone who told someone else, as these things travel in a city where every industry is smaller than it appears. I was already in the parking lot. I drove to Poplar Avenue that afternoon with Nora. I had the key and a flashlight and no particular expectation beyond a vacant space I could build into something over time with what I had. I unlocked the side entrance and went in. The acoustic treatment stopped me before I had taken 4 steps. Professional broadband absorbers on every wall. Not the foam squares you bought online, but the real material, properly mounted, the kind that costs $30 a square foot and requires a specialist who understands the physics of what they are doing. The floating floor visible at the perimeter where the isolation gap showed between the floating surface and the fixed wall. The isolation booth in the northeast corner with its glass intact and its acoustic door sealed correctly on the hinges that kept it airtight. I stood in the space with my flashlight and I recalibrated what I was looking at. Then I saw the canvas cover. It was in the control room section of the space, a purpose-built area separated from the main room by a low wall and the remains of a glass partition, one panel of which had been removed at some point. The cover was large. It draped over something that rose to approximately desk height and extended about 8 feet across. I walked to it. I stood in front of it for a moment. Then I lifted the corner. I set the flashlight on the floor and crouched down. A Neve 8078, 72 channels, the original faders. The original EQ modules, the ones with the specific color coding of the 1970s production run, the ones I had seen in photographs of legendary studios and in one museum display in Nashville when I was 28 years old. The original meter bridge, dusty from 18 months of vacancy, sitting in a climate-controlled space that the previous tenant had installed specifically to protect it, which meant it had been protected even after the people who installed the protection were gone. I put my hand flat on the top of the console. I stayed like that for a while. Nora had followed me in. She was standing in the doorway of the control room section, looking at her father crouched in front of something she had never seen before. She said, "Dad, what is it?" I said, "It's a Neve." She said, "What's a Neve?" I kept my hand on the console. I looked at the meter bridge. I thought about every session I had ever produced in a bedroom or a rented room or a converted closet, every time I had reached for a sound that my equipment could approach but not quite touch, every artist who had come to me because I was good and left the session knowing that what we had made was close but not the thing itself. I thought about my grandmother at the far end of a piano bench. You hear it before you play it. That's the whole thing. I said, "It's the reason this is going to work." I called Otis Webb that evening. Otis was 66 years old and had spent 35 years as a session musician and studio engineer in Memphis, playing bass on records that people still listened to on late nights without knowing his name, engineering sessions at studios that had since been demolished or converted to other uses. He had been present in the Memphis recording world since 1975, and he carried its institutional knowledge the way certain people carry things, quietly, completely, without advertising the weight of it. He retired from active sessions in 2010. He lived in Midtown Memphis, 5 minutes from anywhere he needed to be. We had known each other for 14 years. He had heard one of my early productions through a mutual contact in 2010, had called me the same day to say it was the best thing he had heard from a Memphis independent producer in 5 years, and had been in my orbit ever since, appearing at sessions occasionally to listen, saying something precise and useful when it was warranted, saying nothing when it was not. When I called him and described what I had found, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be there in the morning." He arrived at 7 a.m. with coffee and a small toolkit and the focused quiet of a man who has been told something extraordinary and has spent the intervening hours deciding whether to believe it. He went directly to the console. He did not speak for the first 20 minutes. He went through every module, testing faders, examining wiring, checking the EQ circuitry on each channel with a methodical patience that communicated clearly that he was not going to arrive at a conclusion before the evidence had been fully considered. At 10 a.m., he sat back in the engineer's chair. He said, "Every module is functional. The output transformers are original. The power supply is clean." He was quiet for a moment. "Ray, do you understand what you have?" I said I thought I did. He said, "Studios have paid $2 million for rooms built around consoles in worse shape than this one." He looked at the console for a moment. "And you have it because you paid attention, and she didn't." I said, "Then we should get to work." He said, "Yes, we should." The setup took 6 weeks. Otis handled the technical restoration of the console, methodical, one module at a time, documented at every stage in the specific way that the history of a piece of equipment like this required. I handled everything else, cleaning the space, having the HVAC serviced, sourcing additional outboard gear through my existing network and Otis's contacts, getting the isolation booth resealed by a specialist, having the electrical system inspected and brought to studio, specification. Diane Park came to see the space in the 3rd week of February. She had heard through the Memphis music community that something was happening on Poplar Avenue. She walked through the room with Otis as her guide, asking precise questions about the console's provenance and the legal status of the equipment. Otis answered precisely. When they reached the control room and Diane saw the console, she stopped walking and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She said, "You need a proper business structure before you open, and you need to understand what that console means for your insurance and your asset valuation." I said, "Are you offering to help with that?" She said, "I'm offering to be your partner. 49% business and legal operations. You keep 51% in all creative decisions." I looked at Otis. He made the specific slight movement of a man who has seen the music business for 35 years and has just watched a good offer being made. I said, "Deal." Nora looked up from her chair in the corner. She said, "Is Diane going to be here a lot now?" Diane said, "Probably yes." Nora went back to her book. Deacon Sound opened for sessions in March 2024. The first clients were independent Memphis artists, people from my existing network who had been working with me in inadequate spaces for years and who came in the first 2 weeks with the specific energy of musicians arriving, somewhere they had not been before, but recognize immediately as right. The sessions confirmed what the setup had suggested. The room sounded the way rooms built around Neve 8078 consoles sound, with a warmth and depth and physical presence that digital equipment approaches but does not reach, that the engineers and producers who have worked in rooms like this describe with a consistency that sounds like mythology until you sit in front of one and play something. Otis sat in on the early sessions. Not as the engineer, I ran the console, but as a presence. 35 years of Memphis recording knowledge sitting in a chair in the corner and occasionally saying something quiet and precise that changed the direction of a session in a way that only someone with that specific history could have changed it. Word moved through the music community the way it moves in that world. Not loudly, not publicly, but through the specific network of engineers and managers and artists and producers who care about how records actually sound and who tell each other directly when they find something worth knowing about. In late March, Otis called a woman named Sandra Ho. Sandra had managed artists in the Memphis and Nashville music community for 18 years. She knew Otis well enough to take his calls seriously and to listen when he described a room the way Otis described a room, without exaggeration, without salesmanship, with the precision of a man who has been in enough rooms to know the difference between good and significant. She called Diane Park the following day and asked for the room specs and a recording sample. Diane sent both within the hour. Sandra called back in 40 minutes. She said her client wanted to come. Her client was Leon Cross. Leon arrived in April with his core band and a producer named Marcus Gill who had worked with him on the Grammy-nominated record 3 years earlier and who had been specific about wanting an analog console for this project. When Marcus walked into the control room and saw the Neve, he stopped walking. He said the model number, the specific designation of a 1978 unit. Otis, standing beside me, said, "Yes." Marcus looked at me. He said, "How did this end up in Memphis?" I said, "Someone didn't know what they had." The session ran for 3 weeks. Leon recorded 11 songs. The room did what it was built to do. Gave the recordings a physical presence that Leon had been trying to find for 3 years, that Marcus had not been able to achieve in any of the modern facilities they had used in Los Angeles and New York and London. Not because those rooms were bad, because they were not this room. The specific quality of what the Neve gave the recordings is difficult to describe to people who have not experienced it and unnecessary to describe to people who have. It is a warmth in the low mid-range, a depth in the transients, a quality that experienced listeners describe when they say an old record sounds like the musicians are in the room with them. The console does not create this quality. It preserves it, the way certain materials preserve heat, by having the right density, the right resonance, the right physical relationship to the signal passing through it. Leon understood this. He had been looking for a room that had it for 3 years. He had found it on Poplar Avenue in Memphis for $1,000. On the last day of the session, Leon sat in the control room after the final playback. The meters were still. The musicians had gone to dinner. It was Leon and Marcus and Otis and me and Nora in her corner chair with her headphones around her neck. Leon was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "This is the record." Otis said, "Yes, it is." Nora, who had been present for the entire 3-week session and had formed specific opinions about every song, looked up from her book and nodded once. She had been waiting for someone to say it correctly. They had. By the end of May, Deacon Sound had bookings through December. Word had moved through 3 more management companies, 2 independent labels, and the specific informal network of engineers who recommend rooms to each other based on first-hand knowledge. An article in an online music publication described the studio as the most significant analog recording facility to open in Memphis in 2 decades. Otis read the article and said the writer had undersold it. In May, I exercised the purchase option on the Poplar Avenue building. The lease had included a purchase option at the assessed value, $285,000, assessed as a commercial garage unit. I financed the purchase through a small business loan using 4 months of Deacon Sound revenue as the collateral basis. The building that Christine had sold me as a worthless shell I purchased at its assessed value, while it contained a console whose insured replacement value Diane's specialist had assessed at $380,000. Christine Marsh's Union Avenue property had been vacant for 9 months by June. She had been in active negotiation with 2 creative industry tenants, a design firm looking for studio space and a music publishing company looking for a Memphis base. Both negotiations had been proceeding at the pace that commercial real estate negotiations proceed, which is slowly and with many pauses. In May, both tenants chose Poplar Avenue instead. The design firm leased adjacent space in my building that Diane had subdivided and listed at competitive rates. The music publishing company signed a lease for a ground floor unit that Diane had negotiated with 2 weeks of focused, efficient attention. Both companies cited proximity to Deacon Sound as a factor in their decision. Neither cited Christine's Union Avenue building as a serious alternative by the time they signed. In June, Christine's lender initiated a formal review of the Union Avenue property's debt service coverage. The building was appraised below the outstanding loan balance. The restructuring conversation that followed was, according to Christine's attorney, urgent. In July, Christine called Diane Park. Diane listened to the terms. She said she would consult her partner and call back. She came to the studio that evening. I was finishing a session, a young Memphis artist, 17 years old, recording her first proper demos in a professional room. She had the quality that the best young artists have, the specific combination of rawness and instinct that formal training can refine but cannot manufacture. I brought the last song to a natural rest point and came out of the control room. Diane told me about Christine's call, the property, the terms, what she thought the building was worth, and what Christine was asking. I listened. I was quiet for a moment. I said, "What do you think?" Diane said, "I think the price is right and the timing is right, and I think you should let me negotiate it." I looked through the glass at the young artist in the live room, who was reviewing her headphone mix with the focused seriousness of someone hearing her own voice in a real studio for the first time. I said, "Negotiate it." Diane negotiated it. The last morning I want to tell you about is a Saturday in July. The previous night's session had ended at 2 a.m. A soul singer from North Memphis who had driven down from Nashville, specifically to record on the console, whose manager had heard about the room from Sandra Ho, who had heard about it from Otis, who had heard about everything from a Tuesday afternoon when a woman in a camel coat had handed me a key and told me she hoped I could find something useful to do with it. The building was quiet, the specific quality of silence that a recording studio holds after a session. Not ordinary silence, but the silence of a room built to contain sound, holding its absence with the same integrity it holds its presence. I was at the console doing a rough mix of the previous night's session. The meters moved with the playback. The faders sat where I had set them. Outside on Poplar Avenue, Memphis was doing what Memphis does on a July morning, hot and heavy and unhurried, the particular weight of summer in a city that has always understood that the best things take time. Nora was in her chair, the Planet headphones around her neck, the sticker-covered armrest under her left elbow. She was reading a book about the history of the Mississippi River, a library book she had renewed twice because she kept finding new things in it. She had been in this chair in every studio I had ever used. She had been in this specific chair, in this specific room, for 6 months now, and the room had come to feel the way rooms feel when they have been worked in long enough to take on the character of the work. Otis came in at 9 with coffee. He sat in the chair beside the console that had become his chair over the course of the spring and summer, and looked at the meters moving, and said nothing for a while. Then he said, "Your grandmother would have liked this room." I had told Otis about Loretta, about the piano in the front room, about Sunday mornings in Orange Mound and the specific understanding of music as something that existed for its own reason and needed no other justification. I said, she would have said it was too much equipment. Otis said, she would have been right. He sipped his coffee, but she still would have liked it. Nora looked up from her book. She looked at the console. She looked at her father. She looked at Otis. She said, "Can I try the piano when we get home?" I looked at her. "You want to learn piano?" She said, "I've been listening for 10 years. I think I know some of it already." I looked at Otis. He made no expression at all, which was his way of expressing that he found something exactly right. I said, "Yeah, we'll try the piano when we get home." She went back to her book. The meters moved. The console hummed with the low frequency of a machine that had been doing its work since 1978 and intended to continue. Outside, the July light was doing what July light does in Memphis, making the morning look like something that has always been exactly this way, as if the heat and the music and the river and the particular quality of the city's patience with time were not conditions, but permanent facts about the world. Some things get sold by people who don't know what they are. Some things sit under a canvas cover for 18 months waiting for the person who does. Some things get handed to you as a way of making you feel small and turn out to be the exact thing you needed to build everything that came after. The Neve knew what it was the whole time. It had been waiting for someone who spoke its language. I had been speaking it since I was old enough to reach the keys of a piano in a front room in Orange Mound, sitting beside a woman who told me once that you hear it before you play it, and gave me the space to find out what that meant. That was enough. It was always enough. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there something you were taught early, by a grandparent, a parent, someone whose way of doing things got into you before you were old enough to have a word for it, that you're still using today without always knowing where it came from? Those things don't stay in one place. They move forward. What did someone give you that you're still carrying? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you today, share it with one person who needs to hear it. You already know who that is. And if you're new here, subscribe. Every week, a story like this one. Real people. Real decisions. The kind that stay with you. Stay.